This is the story of Lucas, a young man with a heart full of dreams and hope. He had always believed that kindness could change the world, that a simple gesture could brighten someone's day. Working as a gas station attendant in a small, sleepy town, Lucas had always found comfort in the idea that every day, no matter how mundane, presented an opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. The gas station itself was a place where time seemed to slow down. There was little hustle and bustle. It wasn't glamorous, and the work wasn't easy, but it allowed him to make a living and keep his head above water. The long shifts behind the counter often gave Lucas plenty of time to think. He would stare out of the window as cars pulled in and out of the station, wondering where those drivers were headed, what stories they carried. It was an odd habit of his, but it gave him comfort to imagine that everyone had a purpose, a journey, even if their paths crossed his only briefly. His own life, however, felt as though it had been on pause for far too long. Lucas had been working at the gas station for over a year now. Despite the struggles, he had fallen behind on rent, his car barely ran, and his savings had evaporated in the wake of an unexpected medical bill. He kept going. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't willing to give up. He believed in the power of hard work, and he believed that one day, things would change for the better. But that belief was starting to feel like a distant dream. It wasn't that Lucas didn't have hope. It was just that life had been pushing him down so many times that he was beginning to wonder if it was ever going to stop. His friends had moved on with their lives, building careers, starting families, and living out their dreams. And there he was, stuck at a gas station, making ends meet and trying not to drown in his own sense of failure. His phone would ring occasionally, but when he saw who was calling, his parents or a long-lost friend, he would ignore it, not wanting to answer the questions he knew would come. But despite everything, Lucas had one thing that kept him going: his kindness. Even in the face of his own struggles, he still believed that being kind to others was the only way to find solace in a world that often felt so unforgiving. His coworkers, though they were kind enough, never quite understood why he insisted on going the extra mile for customers. To them, the gas station was just a job, nothing more, nothing less. But Lucas, with his idealistic view of the world, felt that each interaction mattered. If a customer needed a recommendation, a quick chat, or even a listening ear, he was there, ready to lend a hand. It wasn't much, but it was what he had to offer. One warm afternoon in early spring, as Lucas wiped down the counter, a familiar, weathered car pulled up to the station. It was an old, beaten-down sedan with chipped paint and a small dent on the side. Lucas didn't know why, but something about that car intrigued him. Maybe it was because it stood out among the modern vehicles that usually rolled through. Or maybe it was because the car's owner had a certain aura about her, an air of wisdom, of experience, but also something else, an air of quiet sadness. Out of the car stepped a frail woman, her hair gray and thinning, her back hunched slightly as though years of hardship had taken their toll on her body. She wore an old floral dress, faded but lovingly cared for, and a pair of simple sandals. As she approached the counter, Lucas stood up and greeted her with a smile, though his heart sank a little as he saw the weariness in her eyes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor," Lucas said, his voice soft and warm, as though the name alone was a salve to soothe her tired soul. Mrs. Eleanor looked up, startled for a moment, as though she had forgotten anyone could be kind. But when she saw Lucas's friendly face, her expression softened. She gave him a small, grateful smile. "Hello, my boy," she replied, her voice raspy but gentle. "Could you fill up my tank, please? I haven't got much, but it's all I have left to get me home." Lucas could tell from the way she spoke that money was tight for her. He could hear it in the way her voice trembled slightly, like someone who had long ago stopped asking for help. He glanced at her hands as she fumbled for her purse, noticing the age spots and the way her fingers shook. But what struck him most was the way her eyes shone, not with the youthful brightness of someone full of hope, but with the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived a long life and endured a great deal of pain. "Of course, Mrs. Eleanor," Lucas said, his tone full of compassion. "I'll take care of everything." He walked to the pump and began filling her car with gas. As he did, He couldn't help but think about how life seemed to have a way of throwing people together when they needed each other the most. The sun was shining bright, the air was warm, and for a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. But peace, Lucas knew, was a fleeting thing in his world. As the tank filled, Mrs. Eleanor dug through her purse, her fingers moving slowly as she counted what little money she had left. Lucas could see her face tighten with worry. She pulled out a few crumpled bills and began to hand them to him, but there was a clear hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't going to be able to pay the full amount. Lucas didn't even think twice. Without a word, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out the rest of the money to cover the cost. When he placed the money in her hand, Mrs. Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "Lucas, she began, but he interrupted her gently. "Don't worry about it," he said, smiling. "I've got it covered." Mrs. Eleanor blinked, clearly moved, her lips trembling as she struggled to speak. She tried to hand him the small amount of money she had left, but Lucas gently shook his head. "You don't need to pay me back," he insisted, his voice kind yet firm. "Just take care of yourself, okay?" Tears welled up in Mrs. Eleanor's eyes, and she grasped his hand with both of hers, holding it tightly as if to offer him her silent thanks. "You're a good boy, Lucas," she whispered. "I can see it in your heart. Don't let this world take that goodness away from you. You'll need it more than you think." Her words, though quiet, resonated with Lucas in a way that he couldn't explain. He watched as Mrs. Eleanor slowly made her way back to her car, the weight of her life clearly pressing on her shoulders. As she drove off into the distance, Lucas stood there for a moment, staring after her. The gas station, the town, and everything around him seemed distant for a few seconds. The kindness he had shown felt like a balm to his own soul, a reminder that there was still goodness in the world. But as he turned back to the counter, he couldn't help but feel the sharp sting of reality creeping back in. He had done something kind, something that mattered to someone. But at the end of the day, his own struggles remained. His rent was due, and he had no idea how he was going to pay for it. His dreams seemed farther away than ever, and the pressure of trying to make something of himself weighed heavily on his chest. For a brief moment, Lucas thought about Mrs. Eleanor's words, "Don't let this world take your goodness away." Perhaps, just perhaps, he was still worth something. But even as that thought flickered in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that life was about to throw another curveball at him. Lucas didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change. What he didn't realize was that this simple act of kindness, this moment of helping someone who could never repay him, would set him on a path he never saw coming, a path full of trials, heartache, and, ultimately, transformation. After his brief encounter with Mrs. Eleanor, Lucas felt a flicker of warmth settle in his heart. The small act of kindness he had shown her, though insignificant in the grand scheme of things, was a reminder of the compassion still buried deep inside him. Helping her, paying for her gasoline when she was short of cash, felt like a rare moment of doing something right. But little did he know, this moment of kindness would be the last straw in a life already teetering on the edge. Lucas had always worked diligently at the gas station, the kind of employee who followed the rules but never expected anything in return. He lived paycheck to paycheck, with little hope for anything better. But that act of compassion toward Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly woman who had reminded him of his late grandmother, was something that felt so deeply right that it had consumed him. In that small, fleeting moment, he felt a sense of purpose again. However, reality hit him like a slap to the face. The gas station manager, who was known for his strict adherence to policy and his cold demeanor, didn't see it the same way. When he received the call from a customer who had witnessed Lucas' gesture, he wasted no time in firing him. He couldn't afford to have employees breaking company rules, no matter how well-intentioned the act was. Lucas had just finished his shift, wiping down the counter and trying to shake off the lingering sadness from his own life, when his manager called him into the back office. His hands were still trembling, but he tried to remain calm, thinking maybe it was just a routine check or a quick discussion. Instead, the moment he stepped into the office, the air felt suffocating. "Lucas," the manager's voice was firm, devoid of any warmth. "We've received a report about what happened today. You paid for that lady's gas, didn't you? Lucas's stomach dropped. The last thing he expected was to be confronted about helping someone. I did, he said, his voice faltering slightly. She didn't have enough to cover it, and The manager cut him off, his expression hardening. You know the policy. You can't make exceptions, Lucas. You can't just bend the rules like that, no matter who it is. Lucas felt a knot form in his chest. He hadn't expected this. Helping someone in need had felt so right, so simple. But now it felt like a mistake. I wasn't trying to. You're done here, the manager said, cutting him off again. It's a clear violation of policy. You've been warned before, Lucas. I'm afraid we can't keep someone who can't follow the rules. Clean out your locker. The words felt like a punch in the gut. Lucas stood frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. One small act of kindness, one moment of trying to make the world a little better, had cost him everything. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization sank in. He had just lost his job for helping someone. The world seemed to spin around him, his body swaying slightly as if the ground beneath him had disappeared. He wanted to argue, to plead, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't have a choice. The decision had been made. As he gathered his belongings from his locker, the finality of it all settled over him. The weight of the rejection felt crushing. His life had been falling apart for months, and now, the last shred of stability, his job, was gone. There was no safety net. No one was there to catch him. Once he stepped out of the gas station, the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. He had nothing left. No job. No direction. The empty streets outside seemed to mock him, just like his thoughts. Everything felt hollow and pointless. But then, just as he was walking away, the sound of an engine revving startled him. He turned, only to see a sleek, expensive car pull up to the station, the screech of tires cutting through the silence. Lucas's stomach twisted as he saw her stepping out of the car. It was Juliana, his first love, the woman he had once thought he would spend his life with, the woman who had left him so easily, without a second thought, and had taken a part of him with her when she walked away. Her presence was a painful reminder of everything that had gone wrong in his life. She glanced at him, and her lips curled into a polite smile. "Lucas," she said, her voice sweet but distant. "It's been a while." He felt his chest tighten as he tried to force a smile, the awkwardness of their past hanging heavily in the air between them. "Juliana, yeah, it's been a while." Her eyes swept over him, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "I saw your post on social media the other day," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Still working at the gas station, huh? I thought you'd be doing better by now." Her words were sharp, like daggers aimed directly at his already fragile self-esteem. He swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat refused to go away. He could feel the weight of her gaze, like she was judging him, comparing him to the man she once knew, the man who had been full of dreams and ambition. "I'm just getting by," Lucas said, his voice shaky. "It's not much, but it's something." Juliana's lips twisted into a knowing smile, but it wasn't the smile of someone who cared. It was a smile of superiority, of someone who had long moved on and was now surveying the wreckage of what was once her life with him. "You were always such a noble guy, Lucas," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Always willing to help others, even when it meant sacrificing your own future. I guess that's why you're still stuck here. Huh? Helping everyone but yourself." Her words stung like venom. The bitterness in her voice made it clear. She wasn't here to comfort him, to offer any support. She was here to remind him of everything he had failed at, everything he wasn't. "I didn't think I'd see you here," she continued, her eyes scanning the gas station like she was evaluating something beneath her. "I thought you had big plans, Lucas. But I guess this is it, huh? This is where you ended up." His throat tightened, and he felt a familiar ache in his chest. She was right in a way. This was where he had ended up. A small, insignificant man who had been discarded by the world, and even by the woman he had once loved. "I guess it is," he said quietly, his voice betraying the bitterness that had slowly crept in. Juliana raised an eyebrow. clearly unimpressed. "Well, I guess you'll figure it out, like you always do. You always did have a way of bouncing back." Her words were dismissive, cold, and final. She wasn't here to rekindle anything, to apologize for the way she had left him. No, she was here to rub salt in the wound, to remind him that she had moved on while he was still stuck. Without another word, Juliana turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Lucas standing there, once again abandoned and broken. Her departure left Lucas speechless, but the words she had spoken continued to echo in his mind. "You always figure it out. Just don't expect me to be here for you." As the hours passed and he stood in the now empty gas station, his heart felt heavier than ever. The rejection, the loneliness, the humiliation of losing his job, and the realization that Juliana had moved on and left him behind were all too much to bear. Yet, somewhere deep inside him, Lucas knew something had to change. It wasn't over yet. Somehow, he had to find a way to pick himself up again. But it wouldn't be easy. Not easy at all. The days that followed Lucas's dismissal were a blur of disappointment and anger. The weight of the rejection, both from his employer and from Juliana, sat heavy on his shoulders like a suffocating blanket. The air around him felt thick with frustration and regret. He spent his nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the sting of his life unraveling in slow motion. Every day felt like a constant reminder that no matter how much he tried, the world would always find ways to remind him that he was small, insignificant. The gas station was no longer a place of refuge. It had become a symbol of his failure. He had been there for years, pouring himself into a job that provided little in return. Now, he was unemployed, left with nothing but the shame of what he had lost. Even the small act of kindness he had shown Mrs. Eleanor seemed to mock him now, like the universe was punishing him for daring to be compassionate. Lucas found himself walking the streets aimlessly, his mind constantly replaying the events of the last few weeks. The failure with Juliana weighed most heavily on him. Seeing her again, after all this time, had been the final blow. Her rejection, her coldness, her words, every part of their interaction had cut him to the core. She had walked into his life like a whirlwind, and now, like everything else in his life, she was gone. But this time, something inside Lucas had begun to shift. The old patterns of self-doubt, the ones that had kept him trapped for so long, were beginning to crack. The rejection hurt, yes, but it also sparked something deep within him. For the first time, he felt the urge to confront the life he had been living and the choices he had made. He couldn't keep letting himself be defined by his failures, by the people who had walked away from him. He had spent so long believing that he wasn't enough, that he would never be enough. But what if that wasn't true? What if there was more to him than the sum of his past mistakes? Still, the pain of being fired haunted him. He walked into the local cafe one afternoon, the bitter taste of coffee not quite masking the bitterness in his heart. He had no real plan, no real direction. The cafe was quiet, a peaceful contrast to the storm that raged in his mind. He sat at a small corner table, nursing a cup of coffee and staring blankly out the window. It wasn't until he noticed a familiar face that his thoughts were pulled from the abyss. It was Mrs. Eleanor. She had returned. The elderly woman had a gentle, kind smile that instantly reminded him of everything he had once hoped for in life. He hadn't expected to see her again, not after their brief exchange at the gas station. But here she was, sitting across from him with a knowing smile on her face. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she simply waited until Lucas looked up and caught her gaze. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, young man," she said softly, her voice like a warm embrace on a cold day. Lucas sighed, shaking his head. "I guess I've been feeling a little lost lately. A little stuck." Mrs. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand in hers. The gesture was simple, yet somehow comforting. "Sometimes, life has a way of knocking us down when we least expect it," she said, her eyes full of understanding. "But I want you to know something, Lucas. No matter how many times you fall, it's never too late to get back up." Her words hit him like a jolt of electricity. For a moment, He felt the weight of everything he had been carrying start to lift. Mrs. Eleanor's kindness, her simple faith in him, felt like a small flicker of light in the darkness. It was a reminder that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely alone in the world. That there was still room for compassion, for hope, even for someone like him. "Thank you," Lucas murmured, squeezing her hand in return. I don't know what to do anymore." She smiled warmly. "Sometimes, it's not about knowing what to do next, Lucas. It's about knowing that you're worthy of better. You're worthy of love, of kindness, and of respect. But you have to believe that yourself." For the first time in weeks, Lucas felt something shift inside him. Mrs. Eleanor's words were like a balm on his soul, soothing the wounds that had festered for far too long. She was right. He had to believe in his own worth. He couldn't keep living in the shadows of his past, measuring himself by the standards of others. The rejection he had suffered from Juliana, from his job, none of it defined him. But it wasn't that simple, was it? Later that evening, as Lucas made his way home, the familiar ache of loneliness crept back in. He hadn't figured it all out. Mrs. Eleanor's words, though powerful, couldn't erase the mess of his life. The bitter truth was that the past couldn't be undone. He couldn't erase the mistakes, the lost chances, the paths not taken. And he knew that no matter how hard he tried to move forward, the scars would always be there, reminders of everything he had suffered. Yet, as he lay in bed that night, his thoughts were different. They weren't filled with self-loathing or the endless cycle of, "I'm not good enough." Instead, he found himself asking a different question. What if this is the turning point? What if, somehow, this is the beginning of something better? He didn't know how or when or even why, but for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a flicker of hope. It was small, but it was there. It was a start. And sometimes, that was enough. The days continued to pass in a monotonous blur. Lucas wandered through his life like a ghost, still reeling from his dismissal at the gas station and the cold, cutting rejection from Juliana. His body carried the weight of his failures, but his heart, though heavy, felt the faintest stirrings of change. Mrs. Eleanor's words had stayed with him, and he couldn't help but replay them over and over in his mind. "You are worthy of love, kindness, and respect." Yet, despite her encouragement, the world around him still felt suffocating. His small apartment, once a haven of solitude, now felt like a prison. Every day was a struggle between the memories of who he used to be, the hopeful, ambitious young man, and the broken version of himself he had become. He kept trying to muster the strength to pick up the pieces, but each attempt felt hollow, as though he were reaching for something just out of his grasp. On a particularly gray afternoon, Lucas found himself sitting in a small park near his apartment. It had rained earlier, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. The park was nearly empty, save for a few scattered joggers and elderly people walking their dogs. He sat on a weathered bench, looking out at the horizon, watching the dark clouds roll in. His hands were clenched in his lap, his mind consumed with all the things he hadn't been able to fix. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. "Lucas." He turned to see Mrs. Eleanor, standing a few feet away, her cane gently tapping the ground with each step. She smiled at him, the same gentle warmth that had comforted him the first time they met. She walked toward him slowly, but there was a certain determination in her steps, a quiet strength that he admired. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. "Of course not," Lucas replied, moving over to give her space on the bench. Mrs. Eleanor lowered herself down carefully, resting her cane beside her. She sat in silence for a few moments, gazing out at the park before finally speaking. "How are you, Lucas?" she asked, her tone filled with genuine concern. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The truth felt too heavy to put into words. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I feel like I'm stuck, like I can't move forward, no matter how hard I try." She nodded, as if expecting this response. "It's hard when you feel like you're standing still while the rest of the world moves on without you. But I want you to know, Lucas, you're not alone in this. It may feel that way, but you're not." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of validation. Mrs. Eleanor wasn't just offering him empty words of comfort. She was reminding him that it was okay to struggle. It was okay to not have everything figured out. It was okay to feel lost. You know, she continued, turning to face him more fully, there's something I've learned in my life. It's easy to get lost in the pain, to focus on what we've lost. But there's another side to it, too. Sometimes, we have to let go of what's holding us back, even if it hurts. It's the only way we can move forward. Lucas looked at her, a sense of confusion tugging at his chest. Let go? Let go of what? Mrs. Eleanor must have seen the question in his eyes, because she smiled softly. Let go of the belief that your past defines you. Let go of the idea that you're destined to be stuck in this cycle of failure and rejection. You are not your past, Lucas. You are not the man who was fired from a job or the man who lost the woman he loved. You are not the man who feels invisible. You are so much more. Her words were like a revelation. He had been holding on to his past, to the mistakes, the disappointments, the rejections. They had become a part of him, defining who he thought he was. But what if she was right? What if he could let go of all that? What if there was more to him than his scars? You think I can do that? He asked, his voice small, uncertain. Mrs. Eleanor met his gaze with a kind, knowing smile. I don't think you can, Lucas. I know you can. Her belief in him, despite everything he had been through, made him feel something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. It was fleeting, yes, but it was there. He could feel the smallest spark of it deep within, just waiting to grow. Before they parted ways, Mrs. Eleanor stood up slowly, offering him one last piece of wisdom. One day, Lucas, she said softly, you'll realize that the real strength isn't in staying in the past. It's in walking into the future, no matter how uncertain it may seem. Lucas nodded, taking her words to heart. She was right. The future was uncertain, but that didn't mean he had to let it frighten him. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past and start embracing what lay ahead. The next morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, Lucas took a deep breath and walked out of his apartment with a new sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure where the road would lead him. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely lost. There was still so much to figure out, but he was ready to try. And as he made his way to the park once again, he realized something. Even if the world hadn't been kind to him, he still had the power to decide who he wanted to be. He was not defined by the failures, by the rejections, by the mistakes. He was something more. Something capable of change. And as he stood there, watching the clouds part for the first time in days, Lucas smiled. Maybe the future wasn't as uncertain as he had once believed. The days after his conversation with Mrs. Eleanor felt different. For the first time in a long while, Lucas didn't feel like a shadow of his former self. Her words had planted a seed in him, tiny, fragile, but there. He wasn't quite sure how to water it yet, but he felt something stirring inside, a longing to reclaim his life, piece by piece. Lucas woke up every day with one thought in his mind. I need to change. It wasn't a grand realization or a sudden burst of inspiration, but it was enough. He wasn't sure what that change would look like, or even where it would take him, but he knew he couldn't stay in the same place forever. He had been wallowing in his failures for so long that the idea of taking a step forward, however small, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. But how did one begin to change after so many years of feeling defeated? Lucas decided to start small. He started with his apartment. The clutter, the dusty corners, the empty walls, it all mirrored the mess inside his mind. So, he spent an entire weekend cleaning, throwing away things that no longer served him, and trying to make his space a reflection of the new life he was hoping to build. As he scrubbed away the grime from the windows, he couldn't help but think back to the gas station. He had been fired for doing something good, for helping someone who needed it, and it had felt like an unjust punishment. But now, standing in the middle of his small, cleaned-up apartment, he realized something. Maybe his true worth didn't come from his job. Maybe it wasn't tied to how others saw him or how successful he appeared to be. Maybe his worth was something deeper. Something that couldn't be taken away. He continued to clean, setting small goals for himself each day. It wasn't glamorous, but it was progress. But even as he worked on the outside, Lucas still had an inner struggle. His past, the ghost of Juliana's rejection, and the lingering doubts about his place in the world were still there. They didn't just vanish because he decided to clean his apartment. Every night, when he lay in bed, the thoughts crept back into his mind like thieves in the night. I'm not enough. She was right. I'll always be stuck. Why bothers? Those thoughts held him captive, trying to drag him back to the dark place where he had spent far too long. But each time they came, Lucas fought them back. He'd learned that it wasn't the thoughts that defined him, but his actions. So, he kept acting, kept moving, even if it felt small, even if it felt like he was walking through thick mud. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon, something unexpected happened. He was sitting at the local coffee shop when he saw a familiar face. It was Mrs. Eleanor. She was sitting by the window, sipping a cup of tea, and reading a book. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, her eyes lighting up with warmth, as though she were seeing an old friend. She waved him over. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but then stood up and walked over to her table. As he sat down, Mrs. Eleanor set her book aside and studied him for a moment, as though she could see right through the defenses he had carefully built around himself. You look different, she said, her voice gentle but direct. Lucas nodded, unsure how to articulate the changes he had been feeling. I've been trying to move forward, to stop letting my past control me. She smiled, her face softening. And how's that going? It's hard, he admitted, his hands fiddling nervously with the napkin on the table. I still think about everything I've lost, about how much I failed. But you're trying, she said, her voice firm with encouragement. That's what matters. Lucas met her eyes. I'm trying, but sometimes I feel like I'm just not enough. I don't know if I'll ever be able to change enough to feel whole again. Mrs. Eleanor placed a hand on his, her touch warm and steady. Lucas, there's no such thing as enough in the eyes of others. You don't need to be anything other than yourself. And you are enough. But you have to believe it, not just for a moment, but for good. Her words struck him like lightning. He had spent so long measuring his worth by other people's standards, by his failures, by his past. What if the key to changing his life was simply accepting himself as he was? Not perfect, not fixed, but whole in his own right. He had been so consumed by what he had lost that he forgot to see what he still had: his kindness, his ability to give, his heart. They had been buried beneath layers of self-doubt and regret, but they were still there. He had to believe in them. But it's hard to let go of all the mistakes, Lucas said softly. I've made so many. Mrs. Eleanor smiled, a twinkle in her eye. We all have our mistakes, Lucas. But what matters most is how we move forward from them. You're not defined by them unless you choose to be. Her words were exactly what he needed to hear. It wasn't about erasing his mistakes or pretending they didn't matter. It was about learning from them, accepting them as part of his story, and moving on. As he left the coffee shop that day, something inside him felt different. He wasn't magically fixed, and the road ahead was still unclear, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely lost. He had a sense of clarity that had eluded him for so long. He could move forward, even if it meant taking small steps. That night, as he stood in front of his apartment window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Lucas felt a sense of quiet determination settle in his chest. He wasn't where he wanted to be yet, but he was no longer where he had been. And that, he realized, was progress. The next day, Lucas took a deep breath and made a decision. He was going to apply for new jobs, not because he needed to fix everything, but because he knew that standing still wasn't an option anymore. He wasn't going to let his past define his future. No matter how long it took, he would keep moving forward. Lucas could still feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had been fired for helping Mrs. Eleanor pay for her gas. In the weeks that followed, the sting of that decision haunted him. The unexpected dismissal had left him questioning everything: his worth, his choices, and his place in the world. The simple act of kindness that had seemed so right in that moment had cost him everything. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. Each day felt like a battle, and the loss of his job had only made everything harder. With no steady income, the bills piled up, and the feeling of rejection consumed him. The worst part was the silence. There was no one to talk to, no one who could ease the crushing loneliness that pressed on his chest. Every day felt the same, a struggle to find meaning in the mundane, a fight to stay positive when the world around him felt indifferent. Despite the setbacks, a small part of him still held on to a flicker of hope. A voice inside kept telling him that this couldn't be the end, that something good had to come from all of this. But each time he tried to hold on to that glimmer, it felt like the darkness around him would swallow it whole. The days stretched on, one blending into the next. He spent his time looking for another job, applying wherever he could. But each rejection only deepened the wound, reinforcing the belief that he wasn't good enough, that no matter how much effort he put in, it would never be enough. Then, one evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, staring at yet another rejection email, the phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number, but something told him he needed to answer. "Hello," he said, his voice still rough from the emotional toll of the last few weeks. "Lucas?" The voice on the other end sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it at first. "Yeah, this is Lucas. Who's this?" "It's Mrs. Eleanor," the voice said gently. "I've been thinking about you. I know things have been hard, but I wanted to check in. I know how much you've been struggling, but I also know how much you have to offer. I believe in you, Lucas." His heart clenched at the sound of her voice. She had been such a beacon of kindness in his life when everything else seemed to crumble. Her words, though simple, felt like a lifeline. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them. "Thank you," Lucas whispered, feeling tears well up in his eyes. I really needed to hear that." "I'm proud of you," Mrs. Eleanor continued. "You're stronger than you think. Don't let one setback define you. There's so much more waiting for you if you just keep going. Keep pushing forward." For the first time in a long while, Lucas felt a spark of something inside him. It was a mix of gratitude, determination, and a flicker of belief. Mrs. Eleanor's words reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to face this struggle by himself. Her encouragement gave him the strength to pick himself up again. The next day, Lucas woke up with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let his past failures define his future. He didn't have to be perfect, but he could keep trying. He could keep moving forward. He spent the next few days revisiting his job applications, tweaking his resume, and honing his interview skills. With each effort, the doubts that had once consumed him began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that he hadn't felt in months. The rejections didn't stop immediately, but something had shifted within him. He no longer viewed them as personal failures, but as part of the journey. He knew that rejection didn't mean he wasn't worthy. It just meant that the right opportunity hadn't come yet. He was willing to keep searching until it did. Then, one afternoon, as he was preparing to head out for yet another interview, his phone rang again. This time, the number was unfamiliar, but it had a different tone to it, something that made his pulse quicken. "Hello," Lucas answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Lucas?" The voice on the other end was warm and familiar. It was Sarah, one of his old friends from college who had recently started working at a marketing firm. "Sarah? What's up?" Lucas asked, surprised but pleased to hear from her. "I've been thinking about you lately," she said. "I know things have been rough, but I might have an opportunity for you. We're looking for someone to join the team, and I think you'd be a great fit." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. Was this the break he had been waiting for? "I don't know if you're still interested in marketing, but we could use someone with your skills. It's not much, but it's a start. I'll send you the details if you're interested." Lucas could barely believe what he was hearing. A real opportunity. A chance to prove to himself that he was capable of more than just surviving. He didn't have to let his past define him. The future was still his to shape. "I'm interested," Lucas said, his voice filled with excitement and gratitude. "Thank you so much, Sarah. I'll take a look at the details." As he hung up the phone, Lucas sat back in his chair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The journey was far from over. He still had much to prove to himself, but for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt like he was on the right path. He was no longer defined by his failures or by the people who had rejected him. He was in control of his own future. As he began preparing for this new opportunity, Lucas couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. He had been knocked down, humiliated, and abandoned, but he hadn't given up. He had learned to embrace his struggles, to see them as lessons, not punishments. And now he was finally beginning to see the fruits of that perseverance. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but Lucas was beginning to understand something important. The journey to healing was never about avoiding pain. It was about facing it, learning from it, and moving forward stronger than before. As Lucas walked through the city streets, the weight of his past seemed to lift with every step he took. It had been months since Mrs. Eleanor's phone call, and the change in him was undeniable. He had secured a job at Sarah's marketing firm, and though it wasn't exactly his dream role, it was a start. He had rebuilt his life, piece by piece, and each day felt like a small victory. His heart no longer ached with the same intensity that it once did. The loneliness and rejection that had once seemed all-consuming no longer had the same power over him. But Lucas knew that his journey wasn't just about finding a job or paying the bills, or even recovering from the devastation caused by his past relationships. It was about something deeper, something he had been avoiding for so long, his own worth. The truth was, Lucas had spent years doubting himself, allowing the opinions of others to shape his reality. He had let rejection define him, especially from those he loved and who had left him. But now, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to reflect, Lucas began to understand something truly transformative. He had been enough all along. His personal growth, however, didn't happen overnight. The transition from a man defeated by circumstances to someone who saw the value in himself was gradual. He worked harder, made new connections, and allowed himself to enjoy life's small pleasures without the constant weight of guilt or fear that had once followed him everywhere. But there was still something missing. Something he hadn't yet fully addressed. A few weeks after starting his new job, Lucas met someone, Lena. She was a colleague at the marketing firm. Their paths had crossed a few times in the office, but it wasn't until an impromptu lunch break that their conversation started to deepen. Lena was kind, intelligent, and thoughtful, a stark contrast to the women Lucas had known in the past. She didn't see him as a project or someone to fix. Lena respected him for who he was, not for what he could do for her or how much money he made. The more they talked, the more Lucas felt the pull toward her. She was different. She made him feel seen, not just for his past mistakes, but for his growth, his intelligence, and the person he was becoming. But there was still a part of him that was terrified of repeating the mistakes of his past relationships, of giving too much and receiving nothing in return. As he sat across from Lena at the coffee shop one afternoon, listening to her laugh at one of his jokes, Lucas couldn't help but feel a rush of warmth flood through him. For the first time in ages, he felt like he was on the verge of something good. But that familiar sense of doubt crept in. Would he be enough for her? Would she reject him the same way Juliana had? But Lena wasn't Juliana. Lena wasn't anyone from his past. And more importantly, he wasn't the same Lucas who had been left broken by rejection. He had learned, grown, and evolved. And the more he recognized his worth, the more he realized that Lena wasn't the key to his happiness. He was. She could be a part of his journey, but he didn't need her to complete him. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, Lucas found himself walking through the park near his apartment. The cool breeze carried with it the smell of fresh grass, and the night sky stretched above him in a blanket of stars. It was here, in this quiet moment, that Lucas found himself reflecting on everything he had been through. The pain, the rejection, the humiliation. They had all been a part of his story, but they didn't define him anymore. He had learned to let go of the past. He had forgiven those who had hurt him, including himself. His mistakes were not his burden to carry anymore. And for the first time, Lucas truly understood what it meant to love himself, not out of ego or pride, but with true acceptance. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his reverie. It was a message from Lena. "Hey, just wanted to check in and see how your day went." Let's grab dinner soon. For the first time in ages, Lucas didn't second-guess himself. He didn't worry about being too much or not enough. He smiled as he typed his response. Dinner sounds great. I'd love to. As he pressed send, Lucas realized that he wasn't just stepping into a new relationship. He was stepping into a new chapter of his life, a chapter where he was no longer ruled by fear, rejection, or the scars of his past. He had found the strength to move forward, to embrace what was coming without clinging to what had gone. Lucas didn't need anyone else to validate him. He had discovered the most important lesson of all. His worth wasn't determined by the approval of others. It wasn't defined by whether or not a woman chose him or stayed in his life. It was defined by his own acceptance of who he was and the growth he had achieved despite the odds. As Lucas continued to work on himself, he couldn't help but think about how he had struggled with self-worth in the past, especially in his relationships. He had always tried to prove himself, to win approval, to be the one who could make someone else happy. But in the end, he had learned that it wasn't about winning anyone over. It was about being true to himself, about understanding his own needs, and knowing that he deserved someone who valued him for who he was, just as he had come to value himself. And, in a way, this realization mirrored the journey many women take when it comes to relationships. It's easy to feel like you're not enough, to wonder why he doesn't choose you, or why things don't work out. But the truth is, when you finally realize your worth, when you know that you don't need to be perfect or to bend yourself into someone you're not, you unlock a power that changes everything. That confidence, that self-assurance, is irresistible. Just like Lucas, many women face the painful challenge of rejection and self-doubt. But the moment you embrace your true worth, you'll see how men respond to you differently. The right man will see you for who you truly are, and he will value you beyond measure. If you've ever wondered why some women seem to have that special something that makes men crazy about them, it's because they've discovered this secret, a secret that makes men obsess over them, even when they don't try. And the best part? You can learn this secret too. It's a technique that works like magic, effortlessly drawing men in and making them crave your presence. If you're ready to unlock the power within you, to turn your relationships around and get the love you deserve, click the link in the description or point to the QR code on your screen. It's time to become the woman who men can't resist. Just like Lucas, it's time for you to embrace your worth and make everything else fall into place.